Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at The Wall Street Journal, and distinguished fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. The Indian political landscape has undergone a tectonic shift after this month's unexpected election result, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government will, quote, struggle to survive, according to Rahul Gandhi, the country's most prominent opposition politician. Modi was sworn in last week, making him India's first prime minister since Nehru to win a third consecutive term. But Indian political analysts have raised questions about the stability of his coalition, which will be the weakest in a decade, forcing the BJP to rely on smaller allied parties to maintain power. The election results saw the opposition India alliance, led by Gandhi's Indian National Congress Party, perform far better than forecast. It also has thrust Gandhi, who is widely expected to be named opposition leader in the next parliament, back to the center of Indian politics. Walter, news or faux news?
News. It's definitely news that the BJP and its allies not do as well in the election as they expected. And to a certain extent, it's news that Congress did better. But I think Mr. Gandhi, who is a seasoned observer of Indian politics, but is also the leader of the opposition party, is overstating what's happened. What seems to be going on is that the Congress party sort of ran a very tough economic and caste-based attack on the BJP, and succeeded in persuading a lot of lower caste and Dalit voters in India that the BJP was actually a sort of in it for the upper caste, and that if the BJP got the big majority, the super majority that it seemed to be looking for before the election, it would use that supermajority to get rid of affirmative action and other programs that are seen as helping lower caste Indians. And it is true that the BJP did much better among some of the higher caste groups in India. Although, again, India is such a complicated country. You know, you go to each state in India, each part of each state, and you get a very different political mix there. But it does not yet look to me like the government is going to be unstable. They've got 60 votes more in the sort of pro-Modi coalition has about 60 votes more in parliament than the India coalition headed by Mr. Gandhi. And it looks as if if anything, there's a significant chance that the government coalition can peel opposition politicians away. I mean, after all, the government has a lot more to offer politicians than the opposition does. But definitely what happened was a kind of a shock to some of the people's, let's say some of the more ideological members of the BJP who thought that the party's Hindu nationalist agenda was on the point of sweeping the nation and eclipsing all previous sort of groupings of caste and region and so on. That did not happen, which again suggests that Indian democracy remains healthy, flourishing, and capable of producing surprises.
One follow-up there. India's been playing an increasingly large and decisive role in strategy and policy planning in the US, in Israel, many other countries, as a kind of counterweight to China in the Indo-Pacific, maybe also to Iran in the Middle East. How much of this depends on Modi, or does India remain our kind of ace in the hole, regardless of whether it's the BJP or Congress in power?
Well, one of the things that the Congress party attacked the BJP for was what it called its passivity against Chinese aggression on the frontier. Worry about China, a sense that China is encroaching on India, is something that actually goes across the political spectrum in India. At the same time, there are other things that go across the political spectrum in India that make it harder to think of India as being a sort of dutiful ally of the United States. That's not going to be that. So nostalgia about the Russia connection is very strong across the political divides in India. And suspicion of Anglo-American neoliberalism is also, if anything, is stronger on the Congress side than on the BJP side. India is not interested in becoming a kind of loyal member of the Greater West. It really does not want the world to become more like the European Union. There are ways in which India's ideas about how the global financial architecture and political architecture needs to change, sort of resonate more in some ways in Moscow and Beijing than in London and Berlin. But at the same time, hard geopolitics kind of drive India toward aligning against China. And I think as Russia has been moving closer to China in recent years, that's complicated India's dream of trying to keep them apart, wedge them apart. I was talking once with the Indian Foreign Minister, Jaishankar, and he said to me, look, if you're interested in working with India to protect us from China and limit China, we're with you. But if your goal is to westernize the world, we don't want any part of it. I think that sentiment is pretty widespread in India. And it's going to complicate American foreign policy, because a lot of the Americans who are, when Americans start talking about democracy versus authoritarianism and, some kind of great struggle here, India is a democracy, yes, but it does not believe in this Western liberal world order that we keep talking about. It has a view of its own.
All right, our second story. President Biden announced sweeping new protections for hundreds of thousands of immigrants who have been living in the United States illegally for years but are married to American citizens. Under the new policy, some 500,000 undocumented spouses will be shielded from deportation and given a pathway to citizenship and the ability to work legally in the United States. It is one of the most expansive presidential actions to protect immigrants in more than a decade, including a, quote, parole in place program, which would offer a path to citizenship by waiving the requirement that migrants who entered the country illegally first leave the country before applying for a green card, and streamlining the process for illegal immigrants to request waivers to allow them to receive temporary visas. Walter, is this news or faux news?
Oh, it's news. And you have to think about this on a couple of different levels. One is political, obviously, where this comes after the president had announced plans to tighten security at the border. And, what I think the president hopes is that, okay, now I've pacified voters by tilting to the right, but I'm worried about alienating some people on the left. And so I'm going to throw some chum on the left, chum on the right, and hopefully I can keep enough chum moving in enough directions so that I'll get reelected in the fall. Well, I mean, presumably he's got pollsters, he's got experts that are talking to him about whether or not that's going to work. Looked at from the outside, I feel like this is one of the cases where you're sort of too clever by half. And, so that you have this big wave of news, you hope that you're attacking one of your major political vulnerabilities by cracking down on open borders and all of this. And now immediately the next week you turn around and undercut it. I don't think this is gonna help, but you know what? I've never been elected to any office since something like the fifth grade, and I don't expect to be so nobody should really come to me and say, what do I need to do to get elected? On a pure, if you just took this out of every kind of political and social context, it makes sense of all the categories of undocumented aliens or illegal aliens or whatever words you want to use. People who are married to American citizens probably have the strongest case for a path to citizenship. They often also have children who are American citizens. And clearly there's an American citizen who, has a strong interest in extending citizenship to this person. So in any kind of settled resolution of the problems of immigration, this is a group of people that one would expect would, would be a priority and a relatively easy case to address. The problem is, though, if you do this without dealing with the whole complex of issues around migration, politically, I think it'd be explosive. And if you look across the world today, not just the Western world, but the world today, the political scars and the rifts that come from immigration that people, for whatever reason, don't think is legitimate are deep, lasting, and are powerful. Why is the far right on the verge or challenging for power in the French parliamentary elections this summer? Why did the far right do as well as it did in Germany? Why do you have a, quote, far right government here in Italy where I'm sitting today? Without the migration issue, none of this would be happening. None of it. Without the migration issue, there would have not have been a Trump term in 2016. I doubt you would have seen Brexit. So you have to think hard about migration and getting it right. And on the one hand, as most Americans understand, even in today's very polarized politics, over the centuries, immigration has been really, really good for the United States. It has been vital to our development. It defines who we are as a people, and it remains economically, intellectually, in every possible way, an important and positive force in the United States. But the last time immigration had reached the level in the sort of the percentage of the population was foreign born that we have today, the public reaction against it was enormous. It revived the KKK in the North. It led ultimately to the crackdown, reducing immigration from Europe by 90%, a reduction that directly helped trap Jews in Europe. Just a ghastly overreaction. And yet, what drove that overreaction was the failure to come up with a policy on immigration that would address the concerns that people had. So while I think that doing something about the status of people who are married to American citizens is definitely a sensible part of a sensible migration policy, without all of the things that you would need to do, it really runs the risk of aggravating one of the president's key weaknesses. And the fact that this is being done by someone just, writing, a sort of a presidential order rather than an act of Congress is going to deepen the sense of many people that somehow immigration is no longer part of the democratic process in the United States, that the powerful ones do what they want. There's no political accountability. If the president was trying to cool migration down as an issue before November, I think he may have had the opposite effect.
All right, final story of the week. China saw the world's biggest outflow of high net worth individuals last year and is expected to see a record exodus of more than 15,000 in 2024, dealing a further blow to its economy, according to a new report from investment migration firm Henley & Partners. Uncertainty over China's economic trajectory and geopolitical tensions are top of mind for many Chinese millionaires in dollar terms who choose to leave their country. The US, China's international arch-rival, stands out as the top destination, according to the researchers. China last year saw almost 14,000 high net worth individuals depart, mostly to the US, Canada, and Singapore, the firm found. Walter, news or faux news?
It's more faux news than news. You know what? 15,000 people is not a lot of people. Wild guess here, a lot more than 15,000 new millionaires appeared in China last year. China is gaining millionaires faster than it is losing millionaires. And by the way, as the number of millionaires in any country grows, the number of millionaires in that country who decide to move elsewhere also grows. Okay. One of the nice things about having a lot of money is you can live where you would like to live. And so, surprise, surprise, Ohio millionaires move to Florida, right? Sometimes. This is not just a protest against Ohio's government's policies or state taxes. It's because it's kind of, you're old and rich. Sometimes it's nicer to be in a warm place. So people who want to try to spin this into some kind of, oh, China's failing, I can feel the failure. I think they're just kind of, this is not the way we would see China fail. It's probably true that on balance, some of the things that are happening with the Chinese Communist Party and the way things are moving under Xi Jinping are probably leading some people to say, you know what? I feel like if I live here, I'm going to be exactly as rich as the Chinese Communist Party thinks I should be. And if they decide I'm too rich, there's really nothing in the law, nothing in the courts that's going to help. So sometimes it can look like a sensible decision to move your money to a place where they have law courts and people can't take your money away without proving that you've done something wrong in a court where you have a full and fair right to present your side of the story. So I think probably on balance, this is a sign that a small sign, the centralization of power in the Communist Party is making capitalists a little more nervous about living in China, but it's not going to bring down Communist Party rule in the People's Republic of China.
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. So, according to the UN's atomic watchdog, Iran has started up new cascades of advanced centrifuges and plans to install others in the coming weeks, which the Biden administration referred to this week as, quote, nuclear escalations. You wrote a column this week, Walter, about America's faltering foreign policy against all three major revisionist powers, China, Russia, and Iran, but noted that Iran in particular is overextended and currently the weakest of the three, and that teaching Iran a lesson about its support for the Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah would not only help stabilize the Middle East, but is maybe also the most feasible way for Washington to reestablish some deterrence when it comes to Moscow and Beijing. I think when it comes to China policy, there's quite a lot of bipartisan agreement now. And with Russia, it's not totally clear what Trump would or wouldn't do differently from Biden. But Iran, it seems like, really kind of remains a pretty partisan issue in American politics and might figure prominently in the election as far as foreign policy issues go. So what do you think another 4 years of Biden would mean for Iran policy? And by contrast, what do you think 4 more years of Trump would do?
Jeremy, those questions are impossible to give a serious answer to. There's so many other factors that could come into it. But let's try to ask ourselves, where is our policy toward Iran right now, and where is it likely to lead? The answer seems to be that the Biden administration wants to do absolutely anything in the Middle East rather than confront Iran. If you look at how hard, Iran is kind of sitting there encouraging Hezbollah, encouraging Hamas, encouraging the Houthis, providing people with money and resources, cover, everything else, training, weapons, you name it. And the United States look at how hard the Biden people are working to. We spent something like $1 billion shooting down missiles and drones in the Red Sea and bombing things among the Houthis. Look at the enormous diplomatic and political energy that's been consumed by the war in Gaza, where the administration this has become, almost the center of administration foreign policy making at a time when they wanted to think about Ukraine, they wanted to think about China. They've just been sucked into it. the Democratic Party being sort of torn apart by contention over, what should we be doing about Gaza? Who should we be sympathizing with? And meanwhile, on top of that, there's the reality that the situation on Israel's northern frontier with Hezbollah has been escalating, the danger of war is rising. And so you have, again, the administration trying to stop yet a third Iranian supported war in the Middle East. That's a lot of effort and a lot of energy. And it doesn't seem to be getting much done. I wrote in a column few weeks ago that Iran has the weather gauge in the Middle East. That is, when Iran wants the Middle East, the temperature in the Middle East to rise, it can do something. It can encourage the Houthis. It can tell Hezbollah to do something, whatever. When it wants to calm things down, it can do that too. And the administration is just sort of kind of haplessly playing Iran's game on Iran's terms. It's gone, and look at how the enormous shift in administration policy. Iran has now sort of played the administration into going from MBS is an enemy of all mankind, and Saudi Arabia needs to be a pariah state, to we want to give Saudi Arabia an MBS ironclad guarantees equal to NATO. We want to help them develop nuclear, sort of nuclear energy, with the ability to do things that could make it easier for them, perhaps, to go into a military program. They're sort of offering Saudi Arabia things that no American president in 75 years has offered Saudi Arabia, a country they were planning to make a pariah. This total flip-flop of policy. All I think the underlying reason is because they really, really, really don't want to admit that their real problem in the Middle East is Iran. Now, to say that the real problem in the Middle East is Iran does not mean that, having the U.S. go bomb Iran is the answer, right? Iran might be a problem, but a war with Iran is not necessarily the answer. That could be another problem, or a worse problem, perhaps. And so the administration is not totally wrong in not wanting to sort of go all in like 2003, shock and awe, let's go regime change, all of those things. That's a path that not many Democrats and frankly not a whole lot of Americans would want to go down. But there are other alternatives. There are other countries in the Middle East that share our concerns about Iran and then some. And there are ways that we could perhaps be in building coalitions and supporting coalitions aimed at dealing with Iran rather than trying to help those same countries cope with the consequences of what Iran is doing. But in the meantime, the overwhelming signal of fear that Washington is sending to the world, Iran is coming closer to nuclear weapons. We can't do anything about it. Iran armed Hamas and has caused huge problems for us. We can't do anything about it. Hezbollah is, building up with Iran's help, and another war could be coming that could drive us absolutely crazy. And we can't do anything about it because we're so darn afraid. That's the impression they're giving. That is deadly. It is destructive. They need to find a way to develop Iran policies that are aimed at changing the balance of fear. We need to fear Iran less, and Iran needs to fear us and our allies more. Iran needs to be the one that worries that escalating a confrontation or causing a war could set off an uncontrollable chain reaction that would destroy the Iranian regime, which is a weak regime in many ways. It is not loved by its people. So the Biden administration has worked itself into a deep hole in the Middle East, and one that is weakening, reducing international respect for its political acumen as we go. It doesn't mean the rest of the world wants a war between the United States and Iran, but competent foreign policy is it's not there. The alternatives are not appeasement and war. There are other things that one can do. And we are not seeing enough of that, in my view, from the Biden administration. Now, would Trump do things differently? He would do things differently. Would he do things better? It's hard to say. Trump's own record toward Iran, there was some toughness, but it wasn't always, this sort of clear, focused, strategic policy aimed at systematically pushing the Middle East in a specific direction that was good for the United States and our friends. And politics played a role in Trump's decisions, and I'm sure they would again. I do think that while that Trump does not want American troops in a war in the Middle East, and this would be shaping his thinking as much as it shapes Biden's. But at the same time, Trump dislikes looking weak. And so he would find the kind of status quo of strategic passivity in the face of kind of steady Iranian encroachment would be something I think he would just sort of emotionally reject. It's just like completely, no, that's unacceptable. We must find something else. Whether he'd find something better, whether the people around him would find something better, that depends partly on who he chooses. It depends also on the nature of events.
One final question on the Saudi issue that you mentioned there. The Saudis, it seems like, have floated their willingness to sign a peace agreement with the Israelis in exchange for a security treaty or defense pact from the Americans, and also assistance with their, quote, civilian nuclear program. Do those two terms that the Saudis have, will they remain a kind of total non-starter in America, or do you think there's a future in which we'd be willing to concede on either or both of those?
In the first place, I don't know how exciting that treaty really is for the Israelis right now. It's no secret that the Saudis see Israel as a bulwark against Iran. And it is also no secret that the Saudis, on religious grounds and political grounds, many Saudis would be happier in a world in which Israel didn't exist, and would also be happier in a world in which somehow the Palestinians were in a better place. But for now, their concerns about Iran outweigh, at the level of policymaking, their feelings about Israel and their feelings about the Palestinians. And that, that's very natural and it makes sense. But we should, this sort of idea that there's this, if we could get like the right countries in the right treaty alignments, then everything in the Middle East would be peaceful, there would be lasting. That's really the nature of politics anywhere. And it's especially not the nature of politics in the Middle East. For example, hypothetically, suppose tomorrow there were revolutions across Iran and the Kurds broke free and the Azeris established, unified with Azerbaijan, and the Shia Arabs broke off from the Persians, and the Persians themselves overthrew the mullahs and established a more democratic government or brought back the son of the Shah. All Arab countries would immediately change their calculations about how valuable is Israel to us? What do we want from the United States? This would change a lot of things. And the whole kind of concept of sort of NATO-style treaties and all, something that the U.S. built in Europe during the conditions of the Cold War, and where we were trying to think of like permanent international alignments, permanent international structures. Those, we already see in, NATO, well, there's Turkey, how much of a, really is Turkey committed to the NATO vision of things? In the European Union, you have a country like Hungary, which seems to be going off in a different direction. So I don't know that trying to create some kind of permanent institutional order in the Middle East is the way. And I also wonder, again, so imagine Iran collapsed into chaos. You might actually see in some countries a revival of protests against their own rulers. Because one of the ways that in a country like Saudi Arabia, you can make a case to the people, to public opinion. Look, you got to put up with the rulers. You might not like this policy of them. You might not like that policy. You might wish you lived in a country that was governed very differently. But look, hey, we got this big danger out here, and we've all got to stick together because otherwise, goodness knows what'll happen. That argument holds weight in times of threat. But suppose the Iranian threat disappeared. What happens to the internal mix of politics in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, in Jordan, in Egypt? Things will change. And as that changes, the role of a relationship with Israel in those politics also changes. So this idea, we should not be thinking that we're right on the verge of turning the page into a new peaceful era in the Middle East, or indeed just about anywhere on planet Earth.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. Speaking of India and China and Iran, Walter, we have a reader request this week. This one from Rahul in Oakland, who wants to know, quote, which country has the best food in the world?
Terrible question to ask. I am in Italy at the moment, and I have to tell you that there is absolutely nothing wrong with Italian food. It is delicious all day long. I particularly recommend to those of you who haven't been to Italy, the cantaloupes of Italy, which almost always reach a level of excellence that even the best cantaloupes in America can only aspire to. Everything is good. But on the other hand, when I'm in India, I find nothing wrong there either. There are countries whose food I find less appealing. Maybe it was because I spent some time in school in England when I was a boy, but things like bangers and mash and toad in the hole just didn't really do it for me. And that sort of ancestral pot of Brussels sprouts that you set on the stove on simmer in October, and every day you scoop a few out and pop a few more in until the spring. Honestly, I didn't love it. So, but on the other hand, English food has gotten better. I'm a man who likes my food, and I generally find almost everywhere I am, there is something to admire, something to like, something to eat.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.